I love that sound. Is there a sweeter sound than that?
Every week I
Or when you,
enjoy hearing it.
yeah, you didn't used to like that sound, but what we associate with it now is, it's a highlight.
Did you have traditional bells in high school like
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Really?
Remember, I'm old. Ish.
Yeah, but ours were weird. Like I think they tried to change the bell sound so it didn't give you that anxiety, but now it's
I remember them more so like being in like primary school, grade school, of like being outside because they would be very, very
recess
loud
bell.
for recess and
Yeah.
everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I get that same thing now because Sanford and Son's my ringtone. So every time I watch an episode and I hear it, I kind of perk up a little bit, just thinking that it's my
Nice.
phone again. But ladies and gentlemen, and everyone in between, we're not here to talk about bells anymore. We are here to talk about what the bloodiest war that ever occurred in war.
Bloodiest battle to ever. Yes, I think it's on record as the bloodiest, deadliest battle to it, definitely in World War II, and from any recorded history that they can actually verify it.
Yeah, just a lot of dead people just in this one little battle within World War II. Like, to say that World War II is extremely violent, probably an understatement. This was the most violent of probably the most violent.
And here's the thing: it was like relatively early on in the war. I think we probably touched on this before during like the World War II, like the European theater, the overview of that. If you haven't listened to that one, go back and listen because then you'll know where in context the Battle of Stalingrad actually occurs. But we kind of like to pick and choose what we're going to pay attention to here for our history, not on this episode or not on this show, but during our schooling system. We don't learn a lot about World War II until we got bombed at Pearl Harbor. Then you really don't hear a lot, like what's going on. And then, boom, Normandy invasion.
Yep.
And we're in it. Europe at this point, while between Pearl Harbor and everything, is completely just engulfed in war. And at this point in the war, when the Battle of Stalingrad happens, you have Western Europe has already been taken over. So the Germans occupy France. They've occupied everything leading over to Russia, and they've actually even tried to invade Russia with Operation Barbarossa. So all of mainland Europe is pretty much under, with the exception of, past certain points in Russia, is under German control.
Well, excuse our American ignorance and patriotism here, but when we learn about World War II, we don't give a damn what happened in Russia. We don't really give a damn what happened until we showed up. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of these things like Stalingrad and like Barbarossa. I love this because this is maybe one of the few initial times that we've made good on being like, this is an overview. We're going to do an episode into it now.
Yeah, that's true.
So this is our little way into it, but we just didn't learn about Stalingrad. We didn't learn about Barbarossa. We didn't really learn about the French invasion.
No, and so what it ends up sounding like when we hear about the United States entering the war, Normandy and everything, is just that that was the only place that we were fighting the Germans. And that because of the might of the Allies, which is true, we were able to push them back into Germany and defeat them, but it was a war on two fronts. And with this battle that goes on what's considered the Eastern Front between Germany and Russia, the battle that we're going to talk about today is basically for the war in Europe, the same as Midway was for the battle in the Pacific.
Very much so,
It
yeah.
was a complete turning point to where the momentum of the Nazi fucking war machine ground to a halt, found an immovable object that that they couldn't get past, and then slowly the tides of the war turned. And at that point, they were on their heels. There was a few instances where it looked like, they were trying to stop giving up ground. But this is on the Eastern Front. This is definitely the pivotal moment where the war turned into Russia's favor. That's very important because all of the resources that are dedicated to the Eastern Front, which were more than dedicated to the Western Front, it tied up so many of those resources. It had so many casualties, not just this battle alone, which the numbers are staggering, but the entire war on the Eastern Front, that we were facing a pretty weakened Germany when the Normandy landings, actually occurred. And it's due to, in no small part, the Battle of Stalingrad as to why that was so successful on the Western Front.
Yeah, to think about how much we build up Normandy, and not to take anything away from it, but we weren't necessarily playing the B team, but everybody that was,
No, you're right. Actually, I'd go lower.
yeah,
You're playing C squad because the majority of the defenders in France were the guys that they had captured over in the other countries, moving on the Eastern Front that they shipped over to man the Atlantic Wall. So even more so, like the fact that they had to send resources that were less trained, less equipped, and less capable soldiers, it made it even easier for the Normandy land. And I'm not saying that they were fucking easy. Of
No.
course they weren't, but there's a reason that they were insanely successful.
Well, and Stalingrad really comes down to kind of the same strategy because we'll get through this quick, then we'll get into the episode. But Germany was pulling people off of the Western Front to send to the Eastern Front because they needed that land. They wanted that land. They felt like it was their time to go do it. So when Stalingrad happens, this is after Barbarossa. This is after that had grinded to a halt. Leningrad was under siege. Moscow had been under siege. And then Fall Bleu, Case Blue that we'll talk about, that sent them into Stalingrad was like a whole nother offensive after winter, basically. So whereas you had Germany pulling people off the Western Front and sending them to the Eastern Front, you had Russia pulling from the northern flanks that are under siege still and that are still there protecting Moscow all the way down to Stalingrad to meet them. And eventually the numbers game just finally catches up to the Germans.
Well, that and fucking Hitler's just complete ignorance and
Yes.
pride.
Yes.
All that and more coming up on the episode Battle for Stalingrad.
Rate, review, subscribe, 5 stars, please. Our platforms are growing a little on socials. Find us on YouTube. Possibly our last episode that we did before this, Louisiana Purchase, has done so much better than we had expected in the first few days since release. And it's so cool to see those numbers and see you guys talking on there when you watch the videos, just in the comment section, talking to us. I'm going to be better about getting in those comment sections. I don't take for granted that we have a YouTube, but it's kind of without a video element on YouTube, it kind of falls behind.
Yeah, we don't have a video element on it. It's
Yeah.
simply just another platform to actually listen to the podcast. So
Yeah, but we keep getting advertisers. You guys keep liking us more and more and more. There's going to be videos on there.
and without further ado, on to Stalingrad. All right. So we kind of talked about it in the intro, but the lead up to the Battle for Stalingrad initially saw Operation Barbarossa, which was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. It's when essentially Hitler and Stalin, who had been playing nice up to that point, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or whatever it was that they signed, of course, based on Mein Kampf, the proof was right there that he was going to go ahead and take on Bolshevism. So they launched this huge surprise operation. I think it was like 3 million German soldiers were sent into the Eastern Front, and they were able to charge all the way to pretty much the gates of Moscow, and trying to go ahead and capture that. They were trying to cut the head off the snake. Of course, leadership wasn't there. They had been evacuated. But by capturing Moscow, effectively, that was going to be them taking the capital and control of that swath of Russia. And so when that ends up coming up short, surprise, surprise, due to a combination of things, Russian winters,
General Winter.
general January or December, January, February, and then also the fact that Hitler at this point had been so successful in his tactics that he believed all of his tactics had to all be fucking gold. And so ignoring this information from actual military leadership, he's like, yeah, we'll just send guys on this insanely large front all the way across Russia, and we'll also have all of the supply chain that can reach them to make sure that they have fuel, ammunition, all of that shit, food, winter clothing. And
Yeah, winter clothing in Germany is not going to be the same thing as winter clothing in
I
Russia.
mean, maybe if you're in the Alps,
But
but
you're getting caught in these situations where if you don't plan to be over there long enough, you have to supply all the winter clothing. So up until that shit gets there, you still have guys standing in leather boots in snow that aren't insulated or anything like that, that are skin tight because they want to try to keep the water out so you don't get trench foot. Like their clothing up into a certain point, once it finally gets shipped in, you just don't have any other really options because you're not out there in a down coat shooting in August.
Yeah,
Like
that's
that's just
true.
not how it works. But yeah, just like you were talking about, how do you really look if you're Hitler at anybody else's plans when Barbarossa was sort of a success? I mean, you had 10 million combatants that took part in this, over 8 million casualties by the end of the operation, just over in the Eastern Front. But the way it all broke down quickly, Army Group North moved on Leningrad, Army Group Center moved on Moscow, and then Army Group South moves into Kiev, into Ukraine. The retreat through Ukraine was fast, very, very fast. But this is because the Russians didn't know that they were going to be turned on.
and at the same time, if you're looking at a map of Europe and you start over by like Portugal, Spain, all that kind of stuff, it just simply widens out the further you get into like Russia. And so, whereas the Nazis had been able to pretty much steamroll everywhere in Europe, it's because they were focusing their troop movements into those areas. You don't have to spread out across a huge swath of France, it's not as wide.
Yeah.
When you start marching into Russia, it just keeps widening out. So you're splitting these armies that have, 300, 400, 500,000 troops in them. You're now taking that strength and you're dividing them. You're sending, like you said, this group north up to Leningrad, which is basically kind of in, not right when you get into Russia, but if you were to get into Russia and then take a sharp left, you'd head up to Leningrad. It's up kind of by Finland, right?
Yeah. Northern city.
Yeah. You then have, having to march in further to Moscow. So that's where Adam, Adam was saying you sent your center group, and then sending your southern group into the Ukraine and Kiev. You're sending them complete. You're sending north, east, and then south. They're not able to support each other. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of miles between some of these armies, and you somehow expect it to be successful because up to that point everything had been successful for you.
Well, and then as fast as they're moving through Ukraine, Group South took the country pretty quickly. They occupied Kiev Kiev, whichever one isn't the Russian one. They took that by the end of September. So June 22nd is when they started this. By the end of September, they had the capital city. The northern group hit Leningrad and basically encircled everything that they could get to on the southern side. It was like 3/4 of a circle, basically, on September 15th. So they're moving at a pace that they probably didn't expect, because to supply all of those troops that are at the front lines, that are sieging, that are going through Kiev, all that stuff, if you move through there 3 days faster than expected, that means that your supply train has to move 3 days faster than expected, and your supply train only moves as fast as you can lay train for the supply.
Well, funny thing about that is the gauge for the Russian tracks
Oh,
and the
yeah.
gauge for the German train tracks and the other ones they used in Europe were different. Of course, countries in Europe are probably going to try to use something more universal because they're, trading and everything. Russia, being more isolationist, kind of was like, no, we're going to have our own fucking train tracks. So even a small difference in the width or, narrowness of those train tracks, all of a sudden you get over into Russian territory and these German trains are like, we can't fucking go anywhere. We're going to derail as soon as we try to move on to this, if we can even move on to it.
I don't even think the Russians use these train tracks. Why? They're 6 inches wider than ours.
Yeah. So you're either having to then co-opt the Russian equipment, which, guess what? It was scorched fucking earth when they were retreating during Barbarossa. They left nothing of use for the Germans to have, like burning crops, fucking scorched earth. So to supply these troops, and from like a logistical perspective, I don't know why I geek out on like the logistics of this because they're so massive.
It's incredible, yeah.
But you're talking about hundreds of thousands of troops, pieces of armor, artillery, everything using bullets or shells. You have to fuel everything, and these aren't fucking efficient.
No,
So
they're tanks.
yeah, so the amount of, and we'll get into some figures when we start talking about how much would be necessary to supply just a small amount, a smaller army when they needed supplies. It's staggering. And when they're looking at the logistics, when Hitler wants Barbarossa to happen, it's got to be a fucking nightmare for these guys in high command to be like, he wants us to do what? And the other thing too, logistically speaking, that was, I guess, Hitler's kind of like way to convince them of it. He's like, we're going to actually already have Moscow captured before winter hits. We're launching this thing in June. We have all the way up until the winter to capture Moscow.
I feel like that still was a pretty rushed procedure.
100%.
Like, even if things went completely right, that's still pretty fast. Like you were saying, September 26th, central group of Russians launches their first attack on Moscow. By the end of November, the attack on Moscow halted by winter because General Winter showed up. The Germans had to retreat back to defensive positions. And this was kind of like Barbarossa finally ran into its first. Moscow held up. Moscow held up very well. Leningrad, some pretty horrific things went on in that city. I don't know if we'll ever talk about it at length, but a lot of eating people, a lot of bad stuff.
We'll have to talk about the siege of Leningrad. And these are symbolic cities as well. Moscow being the capital of power, you have that.
Yeah.
The other two cities that would not be surrendered are going to be Leningrad, named after Vladimir Lenin. You also have Stalingrad, named after the dear leader, fucking Joseph Stalin. As symbols, to lose those two cities named after essentially the namesakes of your government at that point just would demoralize the entire nation. Leningrad actually is under siege for quite a while, so that's tying up a bunch of troops, German troops in Russia. And then as this middle section has to fall back to these defensive positions, and when we say fall back, we mean like retreat hundreds of miles back to places where you can get resupplied and basically hunker down and be safe for the winter, be resupplied, try not to have your guys fucking die during the winter due to the weather. So they basically are like, we'll fucking have to do something about Moscow in the future. Well, spring comes along, and at this point, Moscow's kind of a pipe dream. But in order to continue the war for Germany and to also cripple Russia, Hitler enacts this, what was it?
German summer. Fall bleu.
Fall bleu.
Case blue.
Case blue. So instead of making an attack on Moscow to try to take the capital, Hitler is going to hit him where it hurts even more, in the oil fields. He's going to simultaneously take the oil for himself to power his fucking Nazi war machine, while at the same time denying those resources to Stalin to where they're not going to have any fuel. So the Caucasus region of Russia is, after they go through Ukraine, if you were to turn south, I think it's between the Caspian and the Black Sea, you have the insanely rich oil fields of the Caucasus. And two places specifically that Hitler had his eye on were a place called Maikop and then Grozny. So
Was it Baku? A pretty big one?
Baku was down, where Azerbaijan is. The only reason I know that's because of F1. But yeah, so going down further than Grozny, you would get to Azerbaijan, which I think is right on the Black Sea or right in there. So they launched this assault, Case Blue. Basically, one group was supposed to head straight from the Ukraine, or where they had their territory there, and not go to Stalingrad, but that group was supposed to almost cut a line to defend the Caucasus region once the Germans took the oil fields from like any type of like Russian counterattack.
Yeah, they wanted to cover the flank, and they wanted to cut off anybody that was going to be coming down to try to reinforce the oil fields from the north. If you go all the way to the Volga River on the other side, you have that flank covered, and you essentially have the whole southern part and the oil fields, all of that cut off.
And control of the river.
Yep.
So the intention for this army group that's going to eventually try to put the hurting on Stalingrad, that's not their mission, sent as this initially. So they're just supposed to almost be providing cover for this southern army group that's heading down to the Caucasus to claim these oil fields. Well, this happens to go pretty well initially because the Russians are thinking that the Germans are going to launch their attack in the north toward Moscow. So that's where they've kind of concentrated their reestablished forces.
You heard about how dumb Stalin was about this, right? About how somebody had gone against Hitler's best words, intentions, and had gone through and typed up this entire Blau mission, and then handed it out to all the generals, and then all the generals handed them out to all the people that were in the need to know. So there were like copies of these, basically the entire operation, that were just floating around. And once Hitler found out, he was pissed. Well, there was a guy that was flying, I think it was over Russia somewhere, and got shot down. And when the Russians came to find him, they found a briefcase that had these plans in it for Blau, and took them to Stalin. And Stalin's like, no, they're gonna attack up north again. Where'd you find this? You found this on a dead guy in a plane that just happened to crash in our area? No, this is intentional. They're fooling us. They're not gonna do this.
Like, Hitler got me once before.
Yeah.
He's trying to pull one over on me again.
So Stalin kept a lot of resources up in the north because he believed that was where this was going to happen. He held the plan in his hands.
Well, he was there too, so he's probably also looking out for number one.
Yeah, very true. That's a good point. Very good point.
So as they're, not meeting a ton of resistance, this group that's going south ends up going to the Maikop oil fields.
Group
and
A.
Just completely destroyed all of the resources, the oil wells, the derricks, all that kind of stuff that are pumping. The Russians are like, well, you may take the territory, but you're not going to be able to use it. So they just destroy everything. So it's going to take a while, once the Germans are there and have secured the area, to actually even bring it up to production. At the same time, they start moving some forces over toward Grozny and kind of meet some heavier resistance there defending that oil field. And because have already kind of captured this one oil field, Hitler decides, okay, what we need to end up doing is we're going to have to set ourselves up to be able to start shipping this oil back to Germany to, use it what we need. And part of that tactic was there were only a certain number of railway lines that went through that certain section. One of them actually went through Stalingrad. It was kind of a hub, basically because of its position also on the Volga River, which is this huge main river, flows down through the Caucasus, so they can also fill up tankers and then send them up the river. The Germans would also have control of the river, so they could use that to send the oil up, put it on trains, and send it back to Germany. So he gets on the phone with this guy, Field Marshal Walther von Reichenauer, and he's like, hey, Field Marshal, we're going to need you to kind of pivot a little bit. We're going to need you to take Stalingrad. Not only is this going to be strategic for us because it's going to give us access to this railway hub and the river and all that stuff, if I can take Stalin City, that's as good as taking Moscow, if not even better.
You're taking the leader's namesake city. Whether you have him captured or not, you have him captured in name already. Do you know what that looks like in the newspapers?
I also didn't know this either. So apparently, the Volga allows access to what's called the Persian Corridor. The Persian Corridor was how the Lend-Lease system between Britain and America was supplying Russia with all of its supplies that the Allies were actually sending them to fight the war. They couldn't supply them through the north because that's where all the fucking U-boats were.
Well, and they said that it was so cold up there that even if they got through, it was just icing over.
But it's crazy to think that ships are going all the way from the U.S. and England all the way down into and I know there were, the Australia and the war in the Pacific, but that merchant ships and all that stuff were just constantly going into that area to get supplies into Russia.
Yeah.
So there's a few different reasons why he's going to end up going after Stalingrad.
What becomes the main one, do you think?
His hubris.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So Stalingrad is the largest industrial center in Russia. So just another little feather in the cap of saying, well, we're going to hurt them not only by taking his namesake city, but we're going to weaken them because we're taking this industrial freaking headquarters that they have. And they get to a place or a town called Kalak, which is it would be to the west, almost due west of Stalingrad. And that's kind of because they knew that the Germans were going to be moving on Stalingrad. They set up their defense in this place called Kalak to try to hold them off and essentially at least wear down the Germans a little bit.
Try
to wear them down just a little bit. And they ended up doing a lot of damage. It was a pretty high cost for the Germans. The fighting at Kalak took place on July 17th of 1942. That's kind of what's recognized as the start of the Battle of Stalingrad, even though it started in a place in Kalak. They were just like, this was to prevent them from getting to Stalingrad, so it's all encompassed into kind of one range of dates. And it ended up costing the Germans quite a bit. They lost a bunch of tanks and everything. And where you're pretty deep into Russia at this point, in fact, the distance from Stalingrad to Berlin is about the same distance as the Canadian border on the west coast of the United States down to San Diego. So that's how far these German armies are currently from Berlin.
Yeah, the length of the West Coast.
Yeah, the length of the West Coast. And because of that, your losses on the German side are much more significant as far as, losing manpower, because it's not easily replaceable, especially not the tanks. Whereas you're in Russia, where they're able to be supplied much easier.
I think I heard a stat today on a podcast. I think the guy said that the body count for Stalingrad, the battle all encompassing, was for one German soldier, there were 12 Russian soldiers lost.
Mm-hmm.
So that was how many people Russia, the winning side, threw at this fight.
It was just a meat grinder, man.
Yeah.
The battle itself takes place between July 7th, 1942, all the way to February 2nd, 1943. So this is how long this battle takes place. Like we said, it's recognized as the bloodiest and fiercest battle in World War II, if not in all of human history. I know we usually save the casualties and losses for the end of it, but I feel like that kind of loses some of it. I feel like giving the numbers, it's going to explain how these numbers got so high when we're talking about it.
Oh, totals? Yeah.
Yeah. So casualties and losses. So the German forces were made up of German troops, Romanian, Italy, and Hungarian, areas that they had already conquered up to that point, or allies. 800,000 of the German army were casualties in this. 800,000. 250,000 recognized dead just in and around Stalingrad. That doesn't account for that was the bodies that had to get left there. Those weren't the wounded or the dead bodies that they were able to, when they still controlled the area, to get those back to Germany and ship those back.
Well, yeah, I mean, that number's really, really hard to quantify, but almost at the same time, when we talk about how many people were in the pocket in Stalingrad and how many people made it back to Germany, how many soldiers made it back to Germany.
Oh, well, yeah.
The numbers are astounding.
Well, I mean, and that's not even accounting for the Red Army. Confirmed dead, over 1 million. Numbers are closer to 1,100,000 dead. And that's in addition to the 40,000 civilians. And I'm guessing that that's a conservative number for civilians, because who was in charge of going through and counting the civilian dead?
Russia.
And they're not going to, 40,000 were the ones that were people like, have you seen my grandma? My grandma died there. Just people that they had to account for. That's not accounting for the people that they didn't want to report.
Yeah, well, they were probably, 20% of these people might have been on vacation. So they probably weren't even in the city when this happened.
And how much worse does it look if you're like, actually, there were 100,000 civilians that died in this? Like, how did you not let them out of the fucking city?
Well, why did they not let them out of the city?
Because Stalin felt that having all of those civilians in Stalingrad would inspire and make the Red Army troops fight even harder.
And if you weren't just being used as an object of desired safety, they would break up into these groups as civilians where they would dig trenches. They would go through and clear out different areas. There were certain militias that were just roaming inside the city, not using guns that they probably used any guns that they had before. I'm sure the Russians went through and swept the city and took as many guns from the civilians as possible because they'd want them in a quote-unquote trained hand of the Red Army. But if you're in those militias and you just see a firefight happen, you just walk up and take the Germans' guns that the other Russians didn't take. That's how you're supplying
You're
these
not allowed to
forces.
leave the city. You might as well try to defend yourself.
Uh-huh, exactly.
So leading up to what's going to be the actual urban fighting, the Russians knew that the Germans were on their way, so they do this thing where they take basically all of the food, the grain, the cattle, all of the good shit that can be used elsewhere, and consider this a harvest victory as they're able to transport it across the Volga River to the eastern side, and all that stuff is safe and protected.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you just took all of the food out of the city that you just are forcing your civilians to stay in. And not only that, but now you're going to be sending in countless Russian soldiers.
This feels like. Have you? Maybe you've seen this. You've seen Book of Eli.
Yes.
Okay, where he's the blind traveler, and he shows up at these abandoned houses in this post-apocalyptic world, and he goes through all of their drawers and everything like that to find that. That's one thing. But these people that are scrounging for food that had basically all been cleared out of this city had just been blown to shit by the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
So any of these buildings you're going into, there's always a 50-50 chance that this thing just collapses because of the collateral damage that's been done.
And once Hitler has, put forward this plan to take Stalingrad, he just throws a shit ton of resources at it. Has the Luftwaffe kind of redeployed from certain areas, even from the oil fields that he's trying to keep, and is basically just going to pound this city into submission. So the Germans actually reach the outskirts of Stalingrad on August 23rd. They arrange on the same day.
Before that happens, just a little Stalin mental chess here. Army Group A, that was down and taken Rostov by July 23rd. The heavier resistance that they got taking the oil fields headed towards the main ones that are in Baku down there. That happens July 23rd. The reason that they got down there so far was because of the fighting and then the retreat. So, Stalin mental chess, July 28th, Stalin delivers something called Order 227. And that was the order in which he proclaimed that not a step back would be taken. And if you took a step back, there would be a row of machine guns behind you, manned by your own people.
Yeah, so Stalingrad ends up getting the entire city is pretty much reduced to skeletons of buildings. Look up some Google images of it. Just put, Stalingrad during the battle. And it, just like Bookie, like it looks like a wasteland. It looks like what I imagine possibly it could kind of look like in certain sections of like maybe Hiroshima and Nagasaki, like some of the outskirts where it just guts the buildings and you see just like a third of a building still standing 3 stories up.
Where it wasn't vaporized.
Yeah, that wasn't vaporized. The Germans bombed this place so much on the same day that their army actually reached the outskirts of the city. The Luftwaffe dropped 1,000 tons of bombs and incendiary bombs on the city. So some of
in
them...
one day. That was just a part of the bombing campaign. That was just the heaviest day.
Yeah, it was 2 million pounds of bombs and incendiaries. So if you've never listened to one of our World War II episodes where we talk about this, you would drop bombs that would essentially cause explosive damage that you would use to like take down buildings, things like that, bomb factories with.
Were these fire bombings?
There was a mix.
Okay.
They would also drop incendiaries because once you've destroyed a building or hit it, if you just drop incendiaries and they land on a building and it's not getting through the stone, it might not have the effect. But if you've blown a bunch of these buildings up and everything's exposed and then you launch fire bombs on it, everything's going to catch. There was also a huge portion of this city. The city of Stalingrad goes along the Volga River, and how most cities are designed, you have like the central part of the city, and then cities tend to grow out in kind of a concentric circle pattern because you're just creating things that are trying to be equal distance to the center of the hub of the city, if it allows you to do that. This city was kind of weird in that it stretched out just along the western bank of the Volga River, and the city itself was an enormous city. The population of Stalingrad, by the time, when the battle, before the battle had started, but when there was just a populace, there was about 450,000. And then once it had accepted a bunch of refugees that had been evacuating, Ukraine and all that area from the Nazi advance, it like swelled up to, I think, 800,000, they said.
That's a lot of people.
So the city itself is basically stretched over 30 miles along the Volga River. And then I don't know how many miles out from the Volga it was. It definitely wasn't 30 miles out. It was more of a kind of a longer city. So you have basically sections of the city where you have people living that aren't stone structures. Everything's made of wood. So this is where the incendiary bombs would just completely torch that area. And during that bombing on August 23rd, 90% of the city housing was destroyed. So instantly, all of your civilians are homeless now. They're all trying to move into sections of the city where there's still any type of shelter that hasn't been destroyed by the other portion of the 2 million bombs that were dropped and reduced a shit ton of stuff to rubble. And again, like you said, that's in one day. They continued to bombard this city so much to where there are very few buildings standing, and the entire ground is just, you're not walking on the ground anymore. If you look at pictures, they're walking on levels of rubble that have just settled and filled in that they're able to move in and out of.
This isn't a wide open city. This ain't Denver. This is Rome. This is streets that are only one car wide in some places. And when you blow those buildings up, those one car lanes that are in between those buildings just become piles of rubble that are just mountains.
And it's an industrial city, so everything's trying to stay more compact to be closer.
Yep.
So you have these areas where stuff might not be spaced very far apart to begin with. This tactic that Germany had used so many other times to kind of like soften up a city and then send in the army to mop up ends up backfiring and biting him in the ass in the most major way possible, because this is the first time we get urban warfare, mass urban warfare.
Yeah, the city was just so big, and again with the way that they were moving. So, like you said, Luftwaffe airstrikes were in August. By August 23rd, the Sixth Army, which is like the creme de la creme of the German military, that was over there, ends up, they reached the northern suburbs of Stalingrad August 23rd. The Axis that were with them, the Hungarian, like Chris said, the Hungarians, the Italians, and the Romanian armies were posted about 37 miles or 60 kilometers outside of Stalingrad, and then everybody starts moving in. And when the Sixth Army advances from the north, there's this group called the Fourth Panzer Army that came from the south. Red Resistance held the south, but the Sixth was aided by another group of panzers, and panzers are just tanks, that opened up a corridor to where they just had a straight shot into the city.
Yeah.
And the belief was that this city was going to be like every other city, I think. They were just going to march in and they were going to clear out. What they hadn't really realized was that Stalingrad was something that Stalin was never going to give up.
No.
There was zero chance that it would never have at least 100,000 Russian soldiers.
No, it would cost them constantly if that city had to be fought over for the entire war. And again, 1 million plus dead on the Red Army side. That should tell you that there was no way that they would stop pumping people into that city. So while this city is like under bombardment, you have basically just to kind of give you an idea of what was lost on the German side. So this isn't, they had more than this. This is just what was lost. 900 airplanes, 500 tanks, and 6,000 pieces of artillery were captured after the Germans had to end up retreating. That's just what they captured. So you constantly had 6,000 pieces of artillery that were constantly shelling this city, trying to basically drive these people out of it. Well, at the same time, over on the east bank of the Volga, they were just bringing in train loads of Red Army soldiers, throwing them onto barges and sending them across the Volga. Well, that would be really nice if you had, Russian planes in the air to make sure that the German planes couldn't get to them, but the Luftwaffe had completely decimated the Red Air Force and had complete air superiority. So as these barges are moving across, either ships taking them across, or they would have tugs that would be able to, drag these huge barges that they use for like lumber and all that kind of stuff. You would just be a slow-moving target along this river, and these German fighters would just constantly strafe this river and strafe these barges. So these guys are getting picked off as they're trying to get across on these barges and pumped into this city.
Well, and it wasn't like the Red Army the Red Air Force didn't have more planes in the air, because at that point they still did too. but it wasn't enough to stop the Luftwaffe from shooting all of them down and maintaining the superiority. And eventually, thankfully, that goes back the other way. But it's not like they weren't trying every option to try to get these soldiers into the cities. But when it's literally the only corridor in, because you have the north, south, and west all blocked off.
Yeah.
There's only one way in. And if there's only one way in and there's no Red Air Force up there to try to protect that area, it's just open season.
Yeah. You're just hoping you can pump enough people in to throw enough meat and human mass at the enemy that they're going to expend all of their resources and have to end up leaving just because they don't have anything to kill you with.
Perfectly put, there's never been a more literally perfect definition than calling this a meat grinder.
Yeah.
Because that's all that it was. There's two perfect analogies that they've used for it, or just, I don't know if it's an analogy, but a meat grinder and a rat war.
Yep.
Because that's exactly what this was.
That's what the Germans, was it Rattenkriegen or something like that? It was Rat War. Kind of like Adam had alluded to with this not one step back directive, you had all of these soldiers that were going into Stalingrad. Again, not a lot of cover. You had these big open squares in some areas that were spaced apart and the buildings hadn't collapsed in them. And you're basically charging through these squares en masse, trying to take ground and force the Germans out. Well, if you're charging out in the open, chances are the other soldiers aren't like, oh, well, they're charging out in the open. We should go meet them out in the open. La, 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 la.
This isn't the Revolutionary War.
No, they are just setting up firing lines in defensive positions and just literally mowing down these soldiers by the hundreds. Well, at the same time, you know, you're basically charging into a fucking buzzsaw, and at some point, someone's going to be like, you know what, this really isn't working. We should probably head back and maybe kind of like reconsolidate our forces and kind of think about our tactics. Well, part of the not one step back order was that once these guys were actually past the Russian line where they started from, they would set up machine guns. And if they saw any Russian soldiers trying to what they considered desert or abandon their posts, they just simply gunned them down. So no one came back from these charges. You were either killed by the Germans. You were picking your fucking poison, man.
Yeah.
You were either going to get killed by the Germans or you were going to get killed by your own. What are you going to do? Go sideways? Well, maybe if I get halfway between and then I just head to the right a lot, I can try to escape.
No, and even if you find a dead German soldier and you steal his uniform to try to go one way or the other, you're not getting very far.
You're either getting killed by the Germans once they catch you and discover who you are, or you're getting killed by the Russians who are going to shoot on sight.
And we talked about this. Yeah, it was before the episode. What was the believed lifespan of a soldier, of a Russian soldier?
The average lifespan once you got into Stalingrad was 24 hours.
And that was 24 hours if you made it across the river that was just constantly being bombarded by the Luftwaffe. And then, as Chris alluded to earlier, maybe you hadn't yet, about the two-man systems.
Oh, yeah. So they would, because they were able to send in soldiers much quicker than they were able to send in the actual equipment for the soldiers, it got to the point where during some of these charges, one guy, would be getting off the barge, they'd be charging up the bank, there'd be a staging area, they're handing one guy a rifle, they're handing the next guy in line just a clip of ammunition. And a guy is basically just saying, hey, here's what's going to happen. You're all going to fucking charge. But what's going to occur is when the guy in front of you that you're using as pretty much a meat shield goes down, you're going to pick up his gun. If he's already fired all the ammunition, that's why you have your little ammunition. You put it in there and you charge forward and shoot. Better not charge backwards.
What are the chances? This is a pretty dark thought. What are the chances that the first guy that gets handed the rifle just fires off every one of his rounds but one, and then just turns around and shoots a soldier behind him and takes his clip? Like, if you run out of bullets and you turn around, you're like, hey, man, give me the bullets that they gave you. The guy's like, no, I'm not going to give you these, because as soon as you get shot, I'm going to need these.
Yeah, I think there was probably enough people dead. You know what? Probably didn't run into that situation, because even if it did occur, no one's going to be there to tell about it.
Yep. Yeah, if you shoot the only other witness,
and you're not coming back alive. You're either getting killed by the Germans or you're getting killed by the guys behind you.
You do what you can to stay alive and to save all those very innocent people that you care so much about inside the city that were strategically left there. But yeah, any kind of programs like that, you had 24 hours to make it through that whole section. But once you got into the city within that 24 hours, they said that you could kind of make.
Yeah, once you got your bearings, your lay of the land, you figured out where this pile was and this other
Yep.
pile. And kind of like we touched on before, because they destroyed all of these buildings, they basically, you're taking a place that you have some semblance of like order to, like we know how to go into this building. We've cleared out buildings before. We've, Paris, all that kind of shit.
You can see a window open in a building that
Yes.
hasn't been exploded.
Now all of a sudden you're looking at nothing but piles of rubble. And anyone could be hiding in those. You could have Russian snipers. We're going to get to a great example of a guy here in a little bit. But you could be walking into an ambush anywhere and you can't see the difference because everything is either gray or covered in snow. The Red Army is wearing, white, like white coverings over their uniforms to be, camouflaged.
They learned that from the Finns.
Yeah. And so it gets down to a point where the Germans are having to basically clear these clusters of rubble, burned out buildings. They're fighting for every foot of the city. They're trying to get footholds in just taking this building and then reinforcing this building and holding it. Then maybe try to move a block up a week later. And it gets to a point where the combat is so fierce that, in war like this, once war is advanced far enough up, you would think that hand-to-hand combat was not a thing because guns are meant to avoid messy things like hand-to-hand combat. It was so prevalent here because you would, German soldier would be walking and they bust into a building and all of a sudden there's 5 Russian soldiers there and there's no room to get your gun up. You're getting charged with a bayonet or a knife. And that's why it's, known for the fierceness of the fighting that went on there. You have civilians that are trapped in the city whose job is to make Molotov cocktails to try to toss down onto these Germans out of their windows and stuff.
Well, this is where you kind of see I don't know if it's a bell curve, but sort of like you have the baseline of how fights used to be fought because they were always at a close distance. You would roll up on another tribe, anything like that. It would happen at a close distance. Mm-hmm. As we had to start trying to fight wars further apart, you see technology raise the curve of how you do things, but also at the same time, it kind of becomes one of those situations where the further away, the more damage is going to be done because you are doing it from you need a bigger target to hit.
Yeah.
But then, on the other side of it, when you shrink a war back down and you put it inside of a city, which is why this whole thing is called a rat war, is when you shrink it back down into a city where you don't need any sort of long-range artillery fire or anything like that, you go back to the same spot that you were before when you were fighting other tribes when it was all hand-to-hand combat. They said during this time, the most important weapons that you could have within the city were a bayonet and a boot knife because your combat was happening that close.
Or a machine gun.
Well, they said that they kind of screwed up some of the groupings that they had of soldiers because one of the groups would have just nothing but bolt action rifles, which are great if you're trying to pick people off from long distances. But if you're anywhere close and you're trying to run that bolt action, it's going to take forever.
Yeah, you aren't able to pump it. You need something that you're walking through a building and you can walk up a staircase and turn it quickly around a corner and just pray and spray. And not get one shot off and try to like work the bolt to put the next, cartridge in.
They had these other groups that had the exact opposite problem. They had machine guns. So up close, they were cool. But if you run into a group of snipers that have bolt-action rifles on the German side and they're picking you off before you can get accurate enough with a machine gun, you're all toast.
So they started to kind of gain this, kind of adapt their tactics and everything, especially, a lot of like booby traps. It's like a fucking Home Alone type situation when, all these civilians are trying to create all these different types of traps and explosives and all this kind of stuff. They're fighting in the sewers at one point in the city. There were certain sections of the city where like the fighting was the fiercest. One of them was, I think, like a huge grain elevator that was like the pride of the city and everything.
You want to get to him?
Yeah, we can get to him.
Okay, I got to him here. This blows me away completely. And whether these stories are true or not, I don't really care. because they're just that badass. But there was about 50 Red Army soldiers that took refuge inside of something called the Stalingrad grain elevator. It was gigantic. It was super duper tall. It was in the south of the city. They held the position for 5 days against 10 different waves of assault that trapped them inside this building. And 50 soldiers is not a lot compared to these waves that are coming into to this grain silo, that they're just going ahead and mowing these guys down. They held it for 5 days. At one point, this was completely surrounded by Germans, and they were just firing inside of it. But this grain silo was built or not a silo, an elevator, whatever the difference is. I suppose it's probably just
when you look at it, it doesn't look. It's basically a very big building, but then about a quarter of it is like 6 to 7 to 8 stories tall.
So it's probably where they move everything up and then push it all over to one side. But these guys held out for 5 days, just 50 of them. And eventually, when it came time for a breakout, they ended up breaking out in the middle of the night. And when the Germans went inside the grain silo, the grain elevator, they found 40 dead soldiers inside, and all of the retreating soldiers that got out burned all of the grain that was inside that was usable, that wouldn't take like forever to dig down to.
Yeah.
But when the Germans came in, like, there's no way that there's only 40 dead bodies in here. These guys held this thing for 5 days against so many people. There's no way it was only 50 dudes that did this if 10 of them broke out.
And the way that this thing was built, if you pull up an image of it, just put Stalingrad grain elevator, this thing was shelled. Like, there's holes all up and down this tower. So it wasn't just, soldiers going in with rifles. Like, they had artillery nailing this thing. And this was just the common denominator for the Red Army throughout this entire battle, is that they were going to make the Germans pay so much for every building, every foot of ground that they cost, that it was basically a war of like attrition, to basically tell the Germans, like, we're not going to run out of people. You guys are going to run out of people a lot quicker than we are.
Yeah, just so incredible. The other fun one too is Pavlov's house. Did you hear about Pavlov's house? Pavlov's house was this fortified 4-story building that was in the middle of Stalingrad. They called it like the lighthouse or something like that. It had some other fun term to it too. But it was in the middle of Stalingrad. Between 30 and 50 soldiers of the 42nd Guard Regiment and the 13th Guards Rifle Division secured from German control. So they took this building and then they went through and they fortified it. They laid landmines on the outside. They strung barbed wire everywhere. They had machine gun nests and anti-tank nests that just lined the windows.
So, 4-story building. It's probably 4 times as long as it is wide.
Yeah.
And when you look at it, everything around it has been destroyed. So it's got this huge view. It's also able to protect the bank of the Volga, so you can be bringing in troops behind it and kind of have cover out in front of them. They held it, and there's some debate because, information coming from one side is going to underestimate, the other one's going to go ahead and pump it up even more. But after they recaptured it, they said the Red Army held it for 60 consecutive days at one point.
The Germans were attacking every one of those days several times a day, too.
So down in the basement, they knocked out all the walls between different rooms, and that's where they would have like their radio communication and command center and communication center set up. And then basically just on all the subsequent floors, windows would have machine gun nests. Up on the roof, they had this, it wasn't like a bazooka like the Allies had or anything, but it was basically, it looked like a rifle, but at the end of it, it would fire a charge, like a kind of a disc-shaped charge, and it was basically an anti-tank rifle. Well, what they did is they kept it up on the roof, so when the Germans would try to get close enough in their tanks and kind of get past the house, they could fire it down onto the top of the tank where the armor was the thinnest, and that's how they would try to take out the tanks that tried to come into this thing.
Well, if you take down a tank inside the city of Stalingrad, you just took down a major piece, because the effort that it took to get around the rubble in those streets to get to the center of Stalingrad, not only if you shoot it down far enough away and it becomes just another impediment down that road for them to try to push anything else through, you're also taking down one of a very, very rare thing going on in that city.
Yeah, something that they can't replace on the other side, even less so than the actual troops themselves. They ended up, this house is still standing. Part of it, a small section of it was actually collapsed and everything, but did you see how they rebuilt it into like a weird kind of like shape? They rebuilt it with different bricks into kind of like a strange geometric shape. I don't know if it's like a memorial or something like that because it looked
Yeah.
like there was a plaque on the outside. But the original building, it remained standing, which is insane to me because of all the fucking air raids and all of the artillery. You'd think that once they tried to launch a week's worth of assaults on this and couldn't claim it, every one of those artillery guns would just vroom, and just be aimed at that, and they'd be launching airstrikes against it.
Yeah, I don't know if they just overlooked it or if it was just that well fortified and that well protected, but that's a long time to hold out, and it held out till it had to, because November 25th, the Red Army goes ahead and shows up and starts forcing the German troops back. And
Can we
as
talk
soon
about
as
the tractor factory first?
oh yeah,
Okay, so another one of these places that were, well known for the fighting was the tractor factory.
yes,
So they call it the tractor factory because it was originally built as a tractor factory, but much like any industry, as soon as the war kicked off, it pivoted and it started making tanks.
what were the P-32s?
T-34s.
Okay,
So the T-34 tank was superior actually to the Russian or to the German tanks. It was, I think, Russians' newest tank that they started manufacturing. It had like sloping armor so it could deflect the shells and everything.
I didn't think at all about that as to how that would be a big deal, but the tanks weren't firing like explosive like bombs, right? They were
It was no kinetic projectile. Yeah, kinetic. Not. They might have had some explosives, but like you're saying, it was just a slug.
just a big lead slug, yeah.
And then it would try to get through the armor, and then because getting through the armor would be so superheated that all the it would just shred everyone inside.
Well, and if just the brilliance of putting a slope to something like that, because if it hits a flat piece of steel, it's going through that flat piece of steel.
Do you want to hear a story about
Yes.
that? Okay.
Yes.
So the thought process behind that, so you had the British tanks, you had American tanks like the Shermans, you had the Russian tanks and the German tanks. If you look at all of the German tanks, a lot of angular, a lot of flat sides and everything. The reason they did that is because they weren't cast. They were actually welded. It allowed them to manufacture the tanks faster, but they had deficiencies. Russians and the American tanks, like the tops of them, they were actually cast. Basically, metal is poured into like a mold and everything, and then it would be one consecutive piece of metal. It would also be curved because if you're shooting and there's any type of, if it's not hitting it perfectly square, it has more of a chance of ricocheting that and everyone is still alive inside. This tractor company was constantly producing these tanks throughout the entire battle up until the point when it was captured. They had, kind of going back over to the civilian side, there was a technical university there. And they had students and staff building what they considered these tank destroyers. They would go in and out of all the scrap pieces of all these tanks, they would actually put together basically a bare bones tank, no firing sights or anything. It would drive off the factory floor from where they built it straight to the front line. And how these things were aimed is, in the tanks when they're shown in movies, it's like you have to like open the, not magazine, I'm trying to think.
Open the port, isn't it?
Like the chamber and then you load in another one. You had to look down the barrel, have it aimed at something, load it in, and then fire it at that point. That's the only way that it could be aimed.
It was like it was a mortar on wheels almost.
That's all it was. And they were just pumping these things out as quickly as possible and sending them directly to the front line. And eventually, I think the tractor factory was captured. It was something that was fought over pretty frequently. There was a big train station that was fought over. And then there was a couple other industrial works, like a steel works, and then something else.
It was a city of industry that was absolutely necessary to keep fueling the Russian war machine. And so not only was it a very big deal for Hitler's hubris to take Stalin City, but knocking out that city would be very effective towards your end goals, because they were producing a lot of important machinery.
They're sitting there producing it right in front of you and trying to shoot you when it's barely functional.
Yeah, they're in there building stuff that will be on the front lines trying to kill you the next day.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's get into some of like the individual stories and then what ends up happening afterward after a bathroom break. Oh my God, Adam, what is that up in the sky? It's a bird.
It's a plane.
It's socials. Oh my God, it's faster than Instagram.
That's historically high pod on Instagram.
More powerful than X.
It's historically high, historically HI on X.
able to leap tall threads in a single bound.
Back to Historically High Pod on Threads.
And, I mean, I guess there's still Gmail, right?
We got that too. That is historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com.
All right, guys, back to the show. All right, let's talk about some people, because there are some interesting people that are some of the key players on this. Do you want to start with the good or the bad?
Was there any good?
Vasily Zaitsev.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No. Let's start with him because this guy's incredible.
So
this is a marksman's marksman.
Yes.
It wasn't even a trained member of the military. Wasn't he like a?
He was a conscript or something, but he had like hunting experience as a kid in the mountains.
That's what I mean, though. Like this guy was just a hunter that had like a desk job in the Red Army.
Just changed his prey from deer to Nazis, and he was good. So Vasily Zaitsev, if the name sounds familiar, and you've seen the Jude Law movie Enemy at the Gates, it's who the character is based on. Very loosely based as far as like the stuff that he did, but
I thought you were talking about he might not have been as hunky as Jude was.
I don't think he was. I don't know if anybody is. I mean, Jude Law for a couple of years was right in the sweet spot there. Vasily Zaitsev was a sniper in the Red Army, and during the Battle of Stalingrad accounted for 225 enemy kills. That includes soldiers and officers. I think he liked to go after officers.
Yeah.
Not only the 225 that he killed, but he also killed 11 German snipers. So he was a sniper hunter as well. This place, they had groups of snipers that would go out. They'd send them out, I think, in teams of like 6, a spotter and a sniper, and they would just cover these areas. And because they could be hiding literally anywhere, they said that just these snipers alone, I mean, and, you know, compared to the actual just regular infantry, there were a small percentage of them. But due to the sniper's reputation of basically just, it's the boogeyman. They could be anywhere. We can't walk through this square without getting sniped. And so you would see like the German soldiers wouldn't move around the city as much during the day. So they got some reprieve during the day until the Germans felt it was safe and could move around at night. And it was due to guys like this, like 225. I mean, I guess when there's that many other enemy soldiers, but to be in those positions and then to get out of them alive.
This is how I kind of draw this to that. He wasn't there for more than a few months.
Yeah. Because as soon as they found out what he did, he was pulled off. Because what's better, having this guy who was basically publicized as like this epitome of the Russian spirit and everything, the same way that the Russians did it and everything. We were just talking about the propaganda with that Gustav cannon that they showed. They had like 2 of them, but Germans probably thought they had hundreds. You get somebody like this, the same way that in the States, if someone would get like a medal for valor, they were immediately pulled back to go stateside to do like bond runs and things. The German, or after they found out what Vasily had done in the city, the Red Army pulled him back and basically sent him to Moscow, and he basically went around and was drumming up support for the Red Army.
But if you're there for 90 days and you kill 225 people, you're averaging like almost 2.5 kills a day.
Yeah. And if he's there for, did you say 2 months?
90 days. 90 days would
even
probably...
if we figure, he's taking out more than 2 guys a day.
That's a pretty hefty clip. And if I can't even imagine killing one person in my lifetime.
Yeah.
This dude's killing
this
2
guy's,
people.
This guy's
2
Baba
plus a
Yaga.
day.
Yeah, he's the boogeyman of Stalingrad, basically. Let's just talk about some of the leadership here, because these are really the assholes that kind of caused this whole thing to happen. So over on the Russian side, in the city itself, organizing and commanding the defense of the city itself is this guy named Chuikov. And I don't know if he's stationed in the city or over on the East Bank, but he's directly in charge of the defense and holding the city. Back in Moscow, you have this guy named Vasily Zukov. It wasn't Vasily Zukov. No, Gregor. George. What? His name is hard to pronounce. It is Georgy Georgy Zukov.
Gorgay?
Maybe. Zukov. Zukov was basically a bigwig in the Red Army and was kind of in charge of planning and mounting the defense of like the Stalingrad area and driving back this Case Blue attack. So over on the German side, when they first start attacking Stalingrad, it is under command of Field Marshal Walther von Reichenauer. Now, von Reichenauer was this the guy that liked to go for the runs, right? Mm-hmm. So he would go for these. So he would go for these runs, out along within the German camp and everything. And one of the days, I think, did he get sick or did it instantly happen?
I think it instantly happened on a run.
Yeah. So on a run, he ends up having a heart attack, and the area that the Germans have control of, both, they don't have a lot of control in Stalingrad. They will at some point, but they also have control of the entire area to the east of Stalingrad. To the west of Stalingrad. East is where across the river.
North, south, east,
exactly.
North, southwest, everywhere.
Yeah. And to their north, I think that's when you were saying where the bulk of the Romanians, Hungarians, and Italians were watching the flank. Basically, the reason they're not bringing in these other soldiers to mount an attack is because the Germans are much better equipped, and they figured much better soldiers. They find everybody else to be those, Untermensch, or what are they called, like lesser people of all these other countries. So they're basically having these other countries kind of like watch their flanks and do guard duty.
And then the Italians are staring at their hands trying to figure out why there's not a hoagie in them.
Exactly. So over on the German side, this Reichenauer guy, after having the heart attack, they basically strap this guy into a chair, load him onto a plane, because they controlled two airfields that were outside of Stalingrad, which is how they were landing all the Luftwaffe planes, bringing in supplies, stuff like that.
What was this guy's rank?
He's a field marshal.
Let's cut you off. They cared about a field marshal enough, a guy who should carry a little bit of respect, right?
Yeah, but he was like incapacitated.
But they just strapped him to a chair.
Hitler ordered him back to Germany for medical care immediately. You don't have time to wait for a hospital stretcher or whatever else they load them onto. They strap him to a chair, load him into a transport plane or like a modified bomber or something like that.
Just don't hit the eject.
Or the bomb bay doors. And send him back to Germany. Well, in a twist of fate, he doesn't make it to the doctor's office because the plane crashes on landing and kills everybody aboard. Well, since he's dead, they're looking for who is going to fill in for him, and leading the army that was kind of making up the bulk of the forces was this guy. Why can't I find his name now?
General Greg Paulus?
Yes.
So, not Greg.
Friedrich. So Friedrich Paulus. He was the guy that basically was picked by von Reichenauer to step in if anything happened to him to take his command. So Hitler's like, yeah, go ahead and put that guy in charge. So Paulus is now in charge of the assault on Stalingrad. And
leader of the 6th Army, right?
He was leader of the 6th Army, and now he's the leader of the whole thing in that area. So as they are just losing men left and right, they're still gaining ground, and they're able to push the Red Army back to the point where the Germans control at one point 90% of the city. It got so bad for the Red Army that at one point they controlled, I think they said it was a 9-mile strip of the city, and at some places was only like a mile wide, backing them up toward the river.
This was maybe the scariest tipping point that I heard throughout all the documentaries and everything that I listened to. I think the guy said 400 yards.
At some of the narrowest points, it was 400, and it was super visible. They could see the river. The German forces could see the river.
So you had 4 football fields in American terms that you controlled up to the river in some points.
Yeah.
That was how you literally had a toehold on the city, like a pinky hold on the city.
Mm-hmm. And then at one point they were divided. The Germans had taken a section in the middle and had divided the forces. And at the same time, again, these ferries and barges are still running, just bringing in more meat for the grinder into this city. What ends up happening is, as Germany is kind of closing the noose and almost taking control of this city, they're planning, this guy Zhukov, who is the overall commander, is planning this thing called Operation Uranus. And while Stalingrad has been tying up so many of these resources, preventing the Germans from being able to advance or make any headway, the Russians have been reconsolidating, massing troops, massing tanks, all of that stuff, and getting ready for this big offensive. And what ends up happening? Do you have anything before Uranus?
No, just a very, very quick. We're talking about like 4 days.
Yeah.
Operation Uranus happens, and just the movement of the offensive is almost poetic. The way that it seems like when the Germans would take an area, it was just blitzkrieg. It was just straight at them. That's what was going on. Now, when they come up to Stalingrad, because they have to only get three sides, it's almost like a pincer movement, but the outsides aren't really important. Those are the guys that are staring at their hands and the guys that don't want to be there. I don't know if Stalin knew that. I don't know if Vasily knew that. But the way that they come out in this kind of pincer movement, they attack the weakest point that was surrounding Stalingrad.
Yeah. So basically, because you have so much room, this isn't a place where it's defensible on a lot of sides. The only defense is essentially the Volga River right behind Stalingrad. So Zhukov basically comes up with a plan where he's going to send one force kind of south to basically the southeast of Stalingrad on the other side, the eastern side of the Volga River. He's then going to have another force come in from the northeast, and they're not going to try to converge on Stalingrad. What they're going to do is they're going to converge in a pincer movement and meet back at that city Kalak, which is miles and miles west of Stalingrad. What that's going to do is essentially all of those German troops that are laying siege to Stalingrad are now going to be trapped in this thing that becomes known as the Kessel in German, or the cauldron, the Stalingrad cauldron. So November 19th of 42 is when Operation Uranus kicks off. Because these Germans decided to use these other, not conscripted, but basically other Shanghaied countries into fighting with them, they're not as well equipped, so they're not going to be able to defend as well. And man, if you're really thinking about it, do you have that much? If you see the Red Army coming at you in the forces they had with all the tanks, at that point you're just like, I'm not even German. Fuck this. I'm out. Because you know what's going to happen because you've heard the stories of what probably happened to German soldiers with the Russians looking for retribution for what the Germans did during their advance during Barbarossa.
That was something that we skipped over that we might need to hit the rewind button on. Not justifying anything that a Russian has ever done to a German during World War II, but as Barbarossa was happening and they were making these movements on Stalingrad, the front lines would go through and burn through a city, and then they had, I think we've made reference to this before, basically like SS kill squads that would go around and murder everyone behind them. And Hitler had given all soldiers basically carte blanche to kill and destroy anyone. The Bolsheviks, was that
Bolsheviks were subhuman.
So the amount of just terrible things that had happened to the Russians at this point all had to have filtered back to every single one of those soldiers that was getting ready to attack.
Do you know the propaganda that the Russians were probably using is that? Like, this is what's happened to your countrymen. This is what the Germans did.
I don't even know if it's propaganda at that point.
It's not. No, that's true. It's just fueling the fire and notifying everybody about it. I like to compare it to that scene in 300 where they first hit the Spartans and everything in that first battle, and all of a sudden they just start pushing them back. And as they're pushing them back and fanning out, you have like 10 Spartans in the back that are just walking with like a spear on the ground. And if they see some guys still moving, that's basically what these SS kill squads would do, is they would move in after the army, where you have people that maybe got away and were hiding, would be like, okay, they've moved on, we can go back and try to, grab some food or do something like that. And you would have these mop-up squads that would come in and basically do these fucking atrocities to these people.
And when we say people, I think it gets maybe not lost, but we're not talking about just the men in these towns. We're talking about
It's these people that are living here, the people that aren't serving, the older people, the younger people, the women that are still like, yeah, it's when we talk about, and Barbarossa is going to get its own, its own episode. It was an insane, insane what happened during that. But yeah, we'll get into some of the. There's a lot of like heinous shit.
Yes.
That happens. But getting back to Uranus, Adam.
always, it always comes back.
So basically, these Romanian troops, the Italian troops, the Hungarian troops, they basically just fucking hightail it out when the Red Army comes knocking. They're able to advance as well from the south, and they actually end up meeting. So it was on the 19th, the North Force attacked. On the 20th, the South Force attacked. They met, both of them met in Kalak on the 23rd. So like you said, 3 days that this thing took to win down.
Pretty fast.
Basically, when you have an encirclement like this, you would try to escape. Yeah, that's probably the best word. And so there's only a few ways to do this. And when we say
break out, isn't that what the that was
out.
the right word?
So you have to do this as quickly as possible, because when these, units are meeting, or these two armies are meeting for the Red Army, it's not like there's a line, a completely impenetrable line, and it makes like the force fields go up and you can't get out of it. Basically, it just means that the advanced units have met each other and have tried to take control of these areas. You still have masses of armor and troop movements and everything that have to get in here. Not everyone's traveling in a straight line. It's not hands across Europe. So there are still opportunities where you can try to sneak your army out, or basically launch an attack and just go in a straight line and hope that you're hitting a weak side, or a force that's not going to be able to resist like a full-on penetrative attack, I guess is the way to say it.
If you got forces that are spread a mile apart, you're hitting a half mile just directly in between them, and the guys on the outside are spraying and praying, the guys on the inside are trying to push as much military and vehicles through.
So word gets back to Berlin, or I think Hitler might have been in the Obersalzberg at one point when he gets this news about this encirclement, and his priority at this point is not to try to get them out of there.
No.
He's basically like, no, like I'm taking this city. We are taking this city. And so he starts coming up with ideas. He's like, well, all we need to do is try to reestablish a supply line. We'll try to punch a hole to try to not get these guys out of here, but to get them more shit to try to take this city, to try to pump more guys in there. And Hermann Goering chimes in and is like, oh, the Luftwaffe could completely take care of that. We don't even have to launch an assault, because I believe they did try to launch one, and the Red Army had fortified it enough to where they couldn't get through. And it wasn't like it was a huge massed force. They were basically just like, the guys that escaped that encirclement, we're going to need you guys to turn around and try to kind of like punch a hole through it. And these guys had just been chased and been fighting. So they're not going to be putting up much of a fight once they try to go back.
Well, then you're not trying to go back. You're not on an offensive mission at this point. You're trying to break through the defense just enough to not get everybody back out, but to start being able to try to feed more people back in.
Yeah.
Like, you're not trying to help an escape. You're not trying to foster a breakout. You're trying to
reaffirm a break-in.
Exactly.
Yeah. You're trying to do a B&E. When this encirclement happens, you have 330,000 Axis troops surrounded. 210,000 of them were German.
That's so many people.
That's the population of like some state capitals.
Yep. Decent sized cities.
It's enormous. And so what are you going to do when your guys have at this point been fighting in the winter? It's freezing as shit. You've probably had supply train issues already up to this point. And now all of a sudden, those supplies, and guess what? I'm guessing your supplies aren't coming enough to you to really build up a lot of stores. You're probably using it you're burning that paycheck as soon as it hits your bank account.
Well,
So,
not to mention too, as the winter sets in, you're having to start all of these tanks and all of these vehicles that don't have antifreeze.
yeah.
So once it gets cold enough it doesn't matter what you do, it ain't gonna turn on. I was
Or you have to run them long enough to keep them from freezing
Yeah.
over, which means you're just burning through more fuel.
There were points I saw them on a couple of documentaries where they were like lighting fires underneath vehicles to try to melt down the engine block enough to try to get them started.
And they were trying to save fuel because the guy that's in charge of Paulus that we kind of talked about earlier, he's like, we're fucking surrounded. They're still able to get radio communication and all that shit out. So they're still talking to like German high command. And he's like, we're stuck here. Like, and they're like, yeah, we're going to try to get you guys out of there. We're going to try. And to him being a military commander, he's like, they can't fucking fly us all out of here.
No.
We're going to have to get all of we have wounded. We have, equipment that we need to try to get. We're going to have to try to punch a hole and try to punch out. So he's also trying to save fuel because he has to get all this shit running, have enough to get his troops out of here. So he's having to be like, I don't think we're going to take this city, and I just need to basically stall here until we get some help. And Hitler has he announces this big promise and everything, like a big national address. He's like, we're going to get the heroes of Stalingrad. We're still going to take the city, but we're going to reinforce them. It was never about we're going to get our guys out of there. It's like we will retake Stalingrad or we will, reinforce our troops. And so everyone in Hitler's circle is like, we already tried this. Like, it's not possible. We need to try to get these guys out. And he's like, I'm not hearing this shit. Nine. And Hermann Goering chimes in. He's like, I think I can actually have the Luftwaffe, he's in charge of. We can totally take care of this. We'll make an air bridge. An air bridge is not what it sounds like. It's not like although they did come up with some crazy shit, an air bridge was not what it sounds like.
It would be cool.
You would just create essentially a supply train of planes because they still controlled 2 airfields within this big pocket that they had.
Which is insane how big that pocket is that you have just 2 airfields in there.
You imagine it like because you got pinchered and you're encircled. I mean, you can get encircled over any distance.
Yeah,
You just can't. So they can still fly supplies in, but this is where the amount of supplies needed to take care of 330,000 troops comes into play. So with the 2 airfields, they would need, I think they said at very bare minimum, 550 tons of equipment and food, ammunition a day. Per day.
Yeah. That was the first math that they had done. And that was like, okay, we can make that happen. Then the guy that did the calculations realized that he had done the math wrong.
Decimal wasn't in the right place.
Comes back to him and he goes, actually, we're going to need like 750 tons of material in there a day. And they're like, I mean, if we could do 550, why not add another 200 to that? We'll be fine.
Well, someone fudged another set of numbers on what it was capable of. So in order to get that amount of supplies in there, you would have to have 350 flights going in there daily. And there were not that many planes that could happen. The amount of fuel that would use just for each day to get them supplies, it was a fucking pipe dream. It just wasn't physically possible. They ended up bringing in, I think, daily about 105 tons. And on like the best day they ever had, it was like 232.
Yep.
And so you have these, Axis troops. I'm not trying to like make it sound bad for them. I'm just like, it's a humanitarian thing, just like talking about the human element, because guess what? These guys get forced into doing this. We talk about this during a lot of these World War II episodes where you're just like, that you're by participating or by allowing it to happen, you are, what's the word I'm thinking?
Culpable?
You're culpable. That's what it is. But at the same time, you might be culpable, but you might be in a position in which you didn't have any way to like anywhere to go or to stand up against it. And you're not wanting to fight in these wars. You're just doing it because this is what you're being forced to do.
Well, and it's such a push and pull because in the beginning, you're like, Russians are pretty bad people. But then you hear what the Germans do to them. You hear what worse people, arguably at that point, and probably overall on the whole.
So bad that you can see what the Russians did and be like, yeah, I understand that. When you can understand like major atrocities and then there's minor atrocities and you're just somehow with the minor atrocities, you're like,
Well, and
it's bad.
It's exactly like you're talking about with the human element. Like, I don't know if I'm alone in this, but I liken it to like a prisoner that's in prison probably did something, unless it was like a white collar crime or drugs or something like that. If you committed a rape, if you committed a murder or something like that, that's a terrible thing and you should be in prison. But just because you did something so inhumane, there's still part of me that's like, but they don't have to be thrown in the hole. Like, there's still like a cruel and unusual amount of punishment to give these people. And the conditions that these Germans were inside, again, even though they're indisputably awful, awful people that did just terrible, terrible things. Mm-hmm. But when you see that, like you say, there are humans inside there, the first drops that they had made into the pocket or the cauldron, they said the first few drops were literally just ammunition and fuel and like very little to no food that they were dropping these people.
I wanted to look up this fact, so I'm just going to wing it. I'm probably going to be wrong. They said it got down to where this was like soldiers getting like 125 grams of bread. It's a very small amount, like caloric intake wise. Not only are you freezing, not able to probably burn anything because you've already chopped down everything anywhere near you, and you can't spread out because Red Army's somewhere out there. I don't know how these guys like went on fighting.
Yeah.
Like I don't get
it's survival instinct.
Yeah, that you're fighting for, you're not fighting for a country at that point. You're fighting for survival. What ends up happening is, as this, pincer movement and this encirclement starts closing in and closing in and closing in, you are just losing these soldiers left and right. Paulus is actually trying to talk to Hitler and is like, I need to surrender here. Like, if we're going to have any hope of saving any of these men, I need to surrender here. And he's like, no. He's like, not happening. He's like, in fact, you've been doing such a phenomenal job that I am promoting you in the field to field marshal. He's like, and just so you know, with these field marshals, in the history of Prussia and also the Weimar and Germany.
Why was Prussia added into that?
Prussia used to be part of it, but Prussia, because I'm going back like saying in the history. So a field marshal has never surrendered. So you would be the first field marshal and be in history as the first field marshal to ever surrender. So he gave him a promotion in the battlefield to basically shame him into not surrendering.
And there is an or here.
Okay. Like for a boat?
Maybe he could have used one to take care of it. There's also some belief that this was maybe a letter to Paulus to kill himself, because he didn't want to be any of these field marshals to be taken alive.
Well, no, that I'm guessing that would have been implied by it. And his orders were to essentially fight down to the last man and the last bullet. So Hitler has pretty much just kind of sold them out at this point.
Oh, yeah.
They were offered during this thing called Operation Koltso. So Operation Koltso is the next phase of it, I guess, in which they're going to be closing in this pocket. January 7th of 43, so we're getting closer to the end here. Very generous surrender terms are offered. Now, would those terms have been upheld? Probably not. Maybe they would have been.
Depending on your rank, I believe they would have been
upheld.
We're
never going to know. But basically, it was like, your men will not be harmed. You'll be fed. All your wounded will be medically taken care of. Basically, just being like, we're not going to commit a bunch of atrocities against you, and we're going to try to make sure you guys stay alive. So Paulus, this is when he basically is asking Hitler. He's like, they're offering this, like, we can save these guys. This is not him worried about German pride or anything like that, because he ends up later on a little bit, you're going to see where he's not caring about that anymore. But he's got to be looking at these men that he's responsible for, and it's like, I got to try to save some of these guys.
Nope.
You don't think that that's like a mentality that like someone like that would have?
Hitler?
Oh, Paulus.
Oh, yeah, no, Paulus for sure.
Oh, Hitler. Fuck no.
Not at all.
No. So Hitler forbids him. He has to turn down that. So on January 10th, 3 days later, you basically had the largest bombardment of the war up to that time. The Russians bombing this pocket, and also because they had been closing in, he had to have these troops. They were losing troops, as they closed in. They had to back in and almost like refortify Stalingrad. So this city that they had destroyed now basically becomes like their last hope for defense. Like ultimate karma.
And this is during the winter time. So they were talking about these airfields that they still had were just kind of systematically being taken out. They were being bombed by the Red Army, who at this point in time had finally launched enough planes to where it didn't matter what or how many the Wehrmacht were shooting down. There were just always that many more.
Yeah.
You could go shoot down 5 planes, but if they launched 12 planes to try to take down your one plane, you're not making it out of there.
They'd been gearing up for this thing for a while to launch this huge major assault.
So as they're hitting these airfields are being knocked out. Well, what does that mean? That means that any sort of supply drops or anything like that are going to have to be concentrated. You only have so much time in a day to be able to try to do these supply drops. If you have less fields, there's going to be more issues. And they said that during the winter time, as it would snow and they would have to go out and try to clear these runways, sometimes they would go out and try to clear them for landings, but they didn't clear out enough of the areas that were cratered from bombs that were dropped on them. So as some of these planes were landing...
the landing gear getting torn off, right? And so then the pilots and everyone are trapped in this.
So yeah, if you're landing to try to drop off supplies and all of a sudden your landing gear rips off the bottom of your plane...
You walk out to your plane for that day and look at your manifest. He's like, fuck, what? I'm flying to Stalingrad. He's like, sorry, man.
You just have to hope that you don't hit one of those craters, because if you do, you're in the shit too.
Everything just looks white.
Yeah.
So as they're getting pushed back into the city and trying to use this as a defensive position, there's nothing in the city. Like, everyone has made sure that there's nothing. You also have the Red Army still pouring people into the city from across the river. And with that, largest bombardment, it was 7,000 guns. I'm not talking pew-pew like rifles and stuff like that. 7,000 artillery pieces. And they tried to level Stalingrad. The Russians did, because they knew that the Germans were in there. So, and that's just, I don't know how anything is still living in there, in that city, if they're just bombarding it with that many guns.
Especially when there's that many people still in the city.
Not only that, but there's not that many targets of buildings that can hold a ton of people, so you're just systematically being like, that one's still standing. That one looks like it still has a roof. Like, you would have concentrated targets that you're looking at. Those airfields that you talked about, January 16th, one of them was lost January 21st, the second one. So at that point, no supplies or evacuation for the wounded. So now at this point, I think Paulus is in communication with Hitler. I'm sure he's been asking him several times about permission to surrender, and Hitler just says field marshal. But he's like, we have nothing to bandage. We don't have a single bandage, which means you have guys getting wounded, shot, shrapnel, all that stuff. Like, what are they? They're dead. No evacuation.
Yeah, you're not only how are you dressing these wounds, you don't have any food left. Like, you're eating dead people. One of the things
there's definitely cannibalism.
Oh, for sure.
Right. Okay.
One of the things that they had talked about was the only real way that you could go get potable water was to go down to the Volga River. And at that point in time, if you're going down to the Volga to get water, there will be snipers sitting on the other side of the banks, or potentially within the city, just aim
on the way.
Yeah. Aim directly there. So what the Germans would do was, because there were still a bunch of orphans in this city from their parents being exploded because they weren't allowed to leave, they would convince these orphans by means of, hey, I have a chocolate bar. None of these assholes had chocolate bars anymore. Just lied to these kids straight out. Just, hey, go get me some water. And these orphans, trusting some sort of an adult, were like, okay, we'll go do it. Stalin just gave the orders to go ahead and shoot the orphans that were going down to the water in order to get water for the German soldiers.
Does your brain have a problem trying to process that and really set it in reality and be like, this is something that isn't fantastic, not fantasticized.
That's fanaticized.
Something like that. Fantasize. Oh, I don't know the word uses I'm trying to get at here. What I'm saying is you have things that like you think of like in a movie or that you've read about, like in a fiction book or something that are made fantastical, I guess.
Yeah.
That they're bumping it up and you're like, well, this isn't real. I'm reading fiction. I'm seeing something that was made in Hollywood. But when you're really thinking about it and like the hopelessness of this entire situation where you're sending these kids, like how much water can these kids are getting killed over a bucket that like a 10-year-old could carry. And then on the other end, to not be like, hey, if you're able to see a kid that's going down and getting water, can we maybe just send someone to go grab the kid?
Follow the kid back.
Yeah. Yell at the kid in your native language where the other guys don't speak your native language and be like, hey, what are you doing? I'm getting water for these guys. Hey, what are they giving you? He said chocolate. We have a ton of chocolate over here. We have hot chocolate over here, and it's warm, and you have clean water. Why don't you come over here? Like, walk down the beach to where one of the sniper positions is sitting. Like, to go to that act. I don't know. I don't understand that. I'm trying to understand the mind of Joseph Stalin, and I can't get into that mindset. But to just, he's so just blasé about the value of the lives of his people that not only is he sending all these people in here to just repeatedly get killed trying to keep this city just because it has his name on it, but at the same time to not care, just they can't just shoot the kids, I guess. If it makes it to where they, dehydrate a little bit more, yeah, just shoot the kids. That, like, how much water are these kids able to carry back?
That's the whole entire thing, is they're not going to take the water back and build water bombs and water guns in any way that they would be able to fight their way out of the situation. You have them so trapped that they're in a place nicknamed the Cauldron. And water isn't something that you're willing to not give up an orphan's life by shooting him.
Not only that, but a couple gallons? How many soldiers and for how long is that going to sustain the amount of... You have... in the city at this point, like 90,000+ soldiers that are still in and defending Stalingrad. How much water are these fucking kids getting? Well, I'm fixating on this.
The water ain't gonna fuel a comeback.
No kidding. On the 22nd of January, Russia actually offers terms again. Unfortunately, they have to be turned down. And eventually... Paulus had set up his command in this place called the GUM or GUM department store. If anyone's ever played Call of Duty, there's actually a Stalingrad level where you're in the attack and everything, and then you play as the character further into the battle where she's like a sniper and everything.
Huh?
Yeah.
Sweet.
And I think the final mission is you're having to kill this German general that's still holed up there. I think it's supposed to be based on Paulus, but you go into this department store and you have to sneak through the department store and then assassinate him. So they put this into even video game shit. But Paulus sets up his headquarters there, and when they eventually broke in, again, still 91,000 German soldiers left, Paulus says he never officially surrenders. He says, "You guys surprised me, and but I won't be providing the order to give up." But basically, I think maybe then the guys below him were he's like, wink, wink. He's like, okay, we'll go disseminate the information. And end up, the figure of people that are captured, it's 91,000 captured.
Well, out of a total that were in the pocket, I believe it was
330,000.
Yeah, 330,000 were encircled. 210,000 German soldiers, between 40 and 65,000 were just the Sixth Army alone. That was how big the Sixth Army was at this point in time. The thing that fascinates me to no end, and these guys really, again, awful people. 11,000 of them resisted and stayed inside the city, and 11,000 of them were systematically hunted down and killed.
Yeah. Well, what happened is as they're moving into these controlled areas, because they're not going to separate and try to spread themselves out when they're holed up in the city. But what happened is, as these forces of the Red Army are coming into the city, they're isolating these pockets and then converging and everything. So yeah, you get these pockets, but to what those had to have been the guys where a few guys in the group had heard about what was going to happen to him, or just knew based on common sense. Is like, do you think they found out what we did, like on the way to Moscow? Do you think that information got back to them? No. You think?
Even if they know, they can't pin it on one of us.
They'll take it out on all of us.
Yeah.
Out of the 91,000 that were captured by the end of the war, when all was said and done, between 5 and 6,000 made it. So sent to Siberia, the gulags, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's due to the fact that they didn't accept the terms of surrender when they were provided, that those few came back, or if the terms of surrender were just going to be bullshit and this was going to be the figure anyway. But based on kind of the history between Germany and Russia at that time, I think it was probably more likely to happen regardless.
Well, and it was likely to happen regardless because you have food shortages going on for your Red Army already currently. So you taking that many hostages and sending them to work camps and gulags and everything like that, you're not going to be able to continue to feed the people that are winning the war for you and feed all of the prisoners.
Yeah, you can't justify that.
Yeah, no, well, you just don't have the resources to do it. So they're going to starve and die pretty much immediately.
Paulus was actually one of the survivors because officers or people in like command positions were provided different treatment.
Yeah.
Everything.
He still spent 10 years in work camps and then was eventually released back to East Germany. So he didn't even get to, well, I guess,
Still had an eye on him.
But which side would you rather have been released to, East or West?
I mean, West.
You think?
Yeah. I don't know.
Either way, you're going back to unfriendly turf.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm thinking of it from a standpoint of, you're going to have to go stand in front of the Nuremberg and all that kind of stuff. But I think in that position where you were a POW, I'm not trying to sympathize here. I'm putting myself in a position of just someone that tried to, you weren't allowed to surrender. You technically did kind of surrender, but I don't know. Like, I'm sure there would have been some type of punishment, but I imagine like even getting out of and having to live under the control of the Soviet Union in East Germany, would they just have you killed at that point? Or if anyone ever found out who you were and you were there at Stalingrad and they Stalingrad stood as again, going back to the beginning of the episode, it was a pivotal moment. It's what they basically bolstered the nation with to kind of start pushing back the Germans. And so I think, I'm dwelling on this too much, but West. I'll go West.
West, that regardless of what they do, you hadn't done as many atrocities to the people on the western side than the eastern side.
And you're protected, I think, by the Geneva Convention or something like that, correct?
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah, I don't think there's that same protection in East Berlin and in East Germany. Some crazy figures. We already talked about the death toll and everything, but just in a 5-month period during the Battle of Stalingrad, because it lasted from July until February, so it was longer than 5 months. But in one 5-month period, the Red Army had 480,000 killed. To put that into perspective, during all of World War II, America only lost 416,000 killed.
I think the bulk of them, too, I heard were Ukrainian that were over there fighting.
For the Red Army?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's insane. In all of World War II, I'm not just talking World War II in Europe. And in 5 months, Russia lost more.
The collateral damage is something that I kind of focused on a little bit because this didn't end the war. This was a turning point in the war, but anything that took place after this war was going to be based upon what supplies you had left to continue to fight the war. So over the entire period of Stalingrad, the Germans lost 900 aircrafts, 1,500 tanks, and 60,000 guns. And that was just what they lost. So not what they destroyed and people were killed in, but the stuff that they had abandoned as they were retreating back.
Yeah.
900 aircrafts that you're going to have to rebuild just to get back to zero, or to get back to even. 1,500 tanks that you're going to have to rebuild to get back to even. Whereas on the other side, you had the Soviets losing arguably tons more shit. 4,300 tanks, around 5,000 aircrafts they lost. But at the same time, their production power was that they could keep matching that and making it happen. So whereas the Germans are kind of on the defensive while fighting in North Africa, while fighting the Western Front, the Russians are like, okay, our turn, and it's time to start heading to Berlin. You guys tried to show up to Moscow, now we're headed to Berlin. It's all coming back around, and you guys don't have 900 aircrafts, and you lost 1,500 tanks.
Yeah. So this actually, and again, this is the very beginning of 1943. The war goes on through 1945 in Europe. So there's still a ton of stuff that happens, but this basically stops the German advance in on the Eastern Front and starts the process of shrinking back German-held territory on that side of it. Again, because of that and because they're getting pushed back, they're trying to just hold a line. They have to keep pumping more and more troops in there, pulling them off the Western Front, and you have the planning stages of the Normandy invasion going through. And because of that, and because it was so secretive, go back, listen to those episodes, you don't have anyone really, they know that you're going to invade at some point, but they don't have the manpower to defend against that.
Running out of resources pretty quickly.
That's why you don't fight a war on two fronts.
And you don't go into Russia in the wintertime.
Yes. Yeah, Napoleon learned that as well.
Yeah, this was a very interesting episode to kind of go into, to dip our feet back in World War II and just to kind of lay out something that I don't know if, like you started with, we didn't
fully
really
pull out of World War II.
Huh?
I never fully pull out of World War II. Always got a finger in or something like that.
But this isn't something that we learned about as kids. This isn't something that was like taught in any sort of World War II history that we learned.
Child nightmares.
Yeah, that's true. Even just a little blurb like, hey, Stalingrad was important. You'll learn about it later.
Yeah, I'm not going to teach my kid about this until maybe 17, 18.
We'll see.
But just, to gloss over kind of the loss of human life during World War II and to know that there were instances like this where just staggering numbers, even in comparison to the other numbers of World War II, but to know how many people were lost during this. And then the city was just flattened. But again, it gets rebuilt, and I guess it's a thriving. It's like the 5th largest or 6th largest city in Russia.
Well, Volgograd is.
Yeah, that's true. It was named Volgograd after Nikita Khrushchev was doing his little de-Stalinization. So yeah, it's if you can't look up Stalingrad currently, it's because it's called Volgograd now. But yeah, just an insanely important moment in World War II that had ripples that basically kind of determined how the rest of the war was going to go, and can't really be understated.
If only Chernobyl was built by the guys that built the grain elevator in Pavlov's house.
Yeah, exactly. Would have been looking at the, you know what? We could still be looking at the Soviet Union. So, I mean, maybe it's better that that didn't happen. I don't know how you want to pro and con that one.
Dominoes fell differently.
Yeah. Got anything else, man?
Nope. I think we're good.
All right, guys. Thanks for joining us on another one, and we'll catch you later.
Peace.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us for another episode. If you like what you heard, hit that subscribe and like button. Follow us. If you didn't like what you heard, still hit that anyway, because we'll probably cover something in the future that you do like. Please follow us on our social media. Adam, hit them with it.
Our Instagram is historically high pod, historically high pod, and we are on Twitter at historically high. That's historically HI.
All right. And if you guys want to send in any feedback, suggestions, hit us up on those two, or you can even do it on Gmail. It's historicallyhighpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again.
Peace.